Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today virtually for our event, Follow the Money, Lessons Learned from the Federal COVID-19 Response. My name is Dylan Schaefer, and I am the Assistant Director at the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government at the Harris School of Public Policy. And I'm really thrilled to have just a few moments to share a bit about our work at the center and kick off what promises to be a really generative, timely discussion with our panel today. The Center for Effective Government has a vital and ambitious mission to strengthen democratic institutions and improve the capacity of government to solve public problems. And through our work, we seek to both generate and elevate ideas from scholars and experts related to democracy reform and government effectiveness into the public square. So obviously, events like this, where we bring together experts and practitioners to consider pressing issues and means of reform, are an essential part of that work. Also, as part of that work, we're really lucky to be able to engage more closely with an impressive cohort of senior practitioner fellows at CEG who work alongside us throughout the year to do important work in various reform issues and who contribute every day to progress on those critical issues in the reform space. They really bring their passion for reform and government effectiveness to this work. So we're thrilled to have the opportunity today to have one of those fellows, Liz Hempowitz, here today to lead us through this discussion. I also want to take a second to acknowledge the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO, our co-sponsor for today's event. Liz and her colleagues at POGO work really tirelessly in furtherance of strong, more effective government oversight, accountability, and transparency. And we're really proud to have them as partners today for the event and across all of our efforts. With that, I want to ensure that we have plenty of time for our discussion, so I'll just close by reminding everyone here today that they can learn much more about the Center for Effective Government and our work by visiting our website at www.effectivegov.uchicago.edu, and about POGO's work at their website, pogo.org. There you can sign up for our newsletters and for more regular updates on our work and our events. You can also find us on Twitter at uChicagoCEG and at Pogo Watchdog. Lastly, I want to remind everyone that we'll reserve a few minutes at the end of our discussion for questions from you all, from the audience. So please feel free to drop any questions you have at any point into our Zoom Q&A function, and we'll be sure to pass some of those along to our panel. With that, I'd like to thank you all again for being here today, and I'm really excited to be able to turn it over to Piyush Prakash, a first-year Masters of Public Policy candidate here at the Harris School, who has the pleasure of introducing our panel of experts. Piyush, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Dylan. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Piyush Prakash. I'm a first-year MPP candidate here, and I'm really delighted to introduce today's speakers. So first, our moderator here is Liz Hempowitz, who is a senior practitioner fellow at the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government. And she's also the vice president for policy and government affairs at the Project on Government Oversight. She has participated in efforts to improve the Inspector General Act and the National Emergencies Act, lobbying and congressional ethics rules, whistleblower protections, the Freedom of Information Act, and other government accountability initiatives. So I'll move on to introduce our next panelist, who is Michael M. Horowitz, who was sworn as the Inspector General of the Department of Justice on April 16th of 2012, following his confirmation by the US Senate. As Inspector General, Mr. Horowitz oversees a nationwide workforce of more than 500 special agents, auditors, inspectors, attorneys, and support staff, whose mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct in DOJ programs and personnel, and to promote economy and efficiency in department operations. Since April 2020, he has simultaneously led the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, a committee of 22 federal inspector general that Congress created to oversee over $5 trillion in federal pandemic-related emergency spending. From 2015 to 2020, Mr. Horowitz served as the chair of the Council of Inspector Generals on Integrity and Efficiency, an organization comprised of all 75 federal inspector generals. Moving on to our next panelist is Joe Ferguson, who is the immediate past Inspector General of the City of Chicago. Prior to becoming Inspector General, he spent 15 years with the United States Attorney Office for the Northern District of Illinois. Ferguson was also a chief of USA's Money Laundering and Forfeiture section and a deputy in the Complex Fraud and Financial Crime section, where he directed cases relating to terrorism, financing, government program, health risks, and bank fraud cases. Moving on, our next panelist is M. Ramred, who served as manager of policy and advocacy for the Chicago Community Trust, helping to develop and advance trust policy strategy. MA leads an important project in partnership with the Urban Institute at CCT called the Federal Recovery Funds Dashboard. Prior to joining the trust, he managed policy and government relations for the Greater Chicago Food Depository, where she advocated for state and federal reforms aimed at combating food insecurity and protecting access to federal nutrition programs. And finally, moving on to our last panelist here, Shane Moulton, who is a senior policy analyst at POGO, and he oversees the effort to develop a blueprint the next president can use to build a more open and accountable administration. Before joining POGO, Sean worked over a decade on transparency and government accountability issues with special attention to freedom of information issues, spending transparency and environmental right to know policies. He has authored reports, testified before Congress, submitted comments on proposed regulations, and helped launch public disclosure websites. With that, I'm happy to turn things over to Liz to begin today's conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Piyush. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to the Center for Effective Government and to POGO for hosting this discussion. And really just thank you all for being with us. We're really excited to dive right in. Before we do that, I will just say if you have any questions throughout today's conversation, I will just reiterate Dylan and strongly encourage you to add them in using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our partners at the center will be grabbing those for us and making sure that we get to them before we wrap up today's discussion. So we're going to dive right into questions, but before we do that, I've got one sentence of context for everybody for today's conversation. Congress has appropriated $4.6 trillion with a T dollars to pandemic relief programs. And according to usaspending.gov, the federal dashboard for tracking a lot of the spending, we will be talking about that a lot today by name, or probably not by name, but that is usually what we are referring to. According to usaspending.gov, $4 trillion of that has been allocated and has been sent around to these programs. And so as we are talking about tracking this money and being able to measure where it's ending up and measure its effectiveness, we're talking about $4.6 trillion, quite a hefty sum of money. So I'm just going to dive right in. Michael, my first question is going to be for you. A few months ago, the PRAC, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, updated its report laying out lessons learned in the process of overseeing pandemic relief funds. One of those lessons seems right on topic for today's discussion. Better reporting is needed to track pandemic relief spending. This section focused in particular on subrecipient data and how that can be really difficult to track. So Michael, can you walk us through a brief explanation of what subrecipient distribution is and why tracking it is so important to measuring the impact of federal spending in our communities?
Sure, absolutely, Liz. And great to be here with everybody. And look forward to our discussion. This is a problem we identified right at the outset of our pandemic oversight efforts. We were created, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, as part of the CARES Act, which was one of the first bills in pandemic relief spending. That was in late March 2020. That was only the $2 trillion bill. It's obviously grown to over $5 trillion, as you've said. And right at the outset, we raised this concern with OMB leadership that relying solely on the data being collected by usaspending.gov, which is what the OMB was doing, meant that you weren't going to get solid recipient reporting data. You weren't going to be able to follow the money downstream. USA Spending does a pretty good job, not a great job, but a pretty good job of dealing with spending at the first tier level, so that individuals, the public, because we're all about transparency as inspectors general, so the public can see where its money went in the first instance. The problem here was that much of this money wasn't designed to go to the first level recipient. It was designed to go downstream further. So for example, one example being the block grants, if you will, not really block grants, but I'll call them block grants, to the states. Well, the states weren't just getting all of this money to use at the state level. They were further disseminating it to localities. They were further disseminating to NGOs, to non-governmental organizations. We didn't have a window into how that money went as it went downstream, as one example in that space. When we raised the issue with OMB back in that time period, they told us they weren't going to do more than what was already required. They were going to rely on USA spending. That meant, as we've written about, as you noted in our first lessons learned report, and again in our second lessons learned report, that policymakers in terms of how this money was used can't understand or know fully how it was used. Did it go to the right people? Did it benefit those it intended to benefit? What impact did the programs have? Right? We have natural disasters. Unfortunately, we don't have pandemics, but we have natural disasters regularly. Congress regularly appropriates hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars to address hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes, etc. And the public should know, and policymakers should know, which programs work and which don't. If you don't have good data, you can't make that assessment. You also can't figure out if it got to the right people, and it makes accountability much more difficult, because that's part two of our job. It's not only letting the public know where the money went, but making sure government agencies are accountable for how they spent the money, and that fraudsters and wrongdoers are held accountable for stealing the money.
You anticipated my next question about how this impacts your ability to look into and mitigate waste and fraud in these programs. But just hearing you explain that and kind of knowing a little bit of some of the reporting requirements that were included in the CARES Act, I would forgive our listeners, our participants, if they assume that policymakers must just be all up in arms about this lack of data collection that is impacting their ability to know how these trillions of dollars in federal funding is being used and being able to measure whether or not it is actually making it to those intended communities. We'll put a pin in that, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Sean, my next question is for you. I know this particular issue is one that you've paid attention to for quite some time now. In my work with you over the last couple of years, I remember pulling up testimony you gave on this issue, I think in either 2011 or 2012 in front of Congress. And so I'd love for you to give us a sense of how these problems compare to what we've seen in the past when it comes to challenges tracking federal spending, and what these continued challenges in this area might mean for the future of data-driven oversight efforts.
Sure. As Michael said, I would have said it a little bit more blunter, that we do a terrible job, and have for a long time done a terrible job of following money below that first recipient. And that first recipient, while being somewhat informative, is far from sufficient. We've complained about it for a long time. Agencies know that the problem exists. They've known for a long time. We have some programs that seem to have no money going out to subrecipients when we know it's being divvied out from state agencies out to projects. And then we have the opposite end of the spectrum. We have projects that, let's say it's $100 million in the prime award, and then the subawards add up to $400 million, and somehow it quadruples. And that's because individual transactions are being duplicated over and over again. As little changes are made, it looks like a whole new transaction. And so you can't rely on the data that is reported. And then if there's no data, you can't trust that either on the subrecipient. And it's incredibly frustrating. We've made some progress in the past. I want to go all the way back to 2009 when we had the American Rescue or American Recovery and Reinvestment Act after the economic problems. And we actually had new data that was being collected directly from recipients. And it included some much better data on who they were giving the money to. It was recipient reported data. And so those prime recipients were filling out sort of an online form, and they were saying, who did they give the money to? Who were their vendors? Who were the subrecipients, grants, contractors, whoever. And talking about like what the project was and how far along it was. And they had to do this quarterly. And it was a much better window than we ever had before into where the money was going. It still didn't go probably far enough, but it was a serious improvement. And then unfortunately, we just kind of let that wither rather than incorporating those lessons learned into our everyday reporting. We just let sort of all the improvements go away. And then when the CARES Act came along, Congress picked up that exact language and put it into the CARES Act bill about recipient reporting. And this is where Michael said OMB told them, we're not going to do more than we're required to do. I would say they didn't even do what they were required to do because they were supposed to launch a whole new round for really big awards, and not that big, 150,000. They were supposed to do recipient reporting, including subawards, and they just skipped it. They basically said, we don't care that Congress made this part of the law. We don't think it's necessary, and we're going to ignore it. And so we never got that for all this money. And it was a big factor in the Reinvestment Act back in the day. And so very disappointed that we didn't see it. In terms of the future, I mean, as I said, we really have to build these improvements in to our day-to-day system. We can't build it over and over again each time there's a big disaster. It's a terrible recipe to be trying to spend the money and create brand new levels of oversight while we're doing it. So, and I'll pause there. I see that Joe has a question maybe.
Yeah, I will, Joe, I'm going to come to you in a second, but, Sean, I did not realize that that statutory language from Congress that had been signed into law was optional. This is news to me. Joe, please go ahead.
I just want to offer a couple of sort of paradigm, just for lack of a better word, kind of paradigm observations, working off of both what Michael and Sean said. And I think Michael made reference to the fact that we have national disaster emergencies all the time. And really what I think we need to embrace is natural disasters and emergencies are a norm. In the moment that they occur, we respond to the jolt of their exceptional and emergency nature. But the fact is, there's emergencies happening all the time now. And climate change will drive them even more. And that has prompted the GAO, working with FEMA, to actually sort of lean into, from their particular discipline, into real-time monitoring and real-time auditing, right? And it's that mindset that we're in an ecosystem, a permanent ecosystem of emergency that actually should open our thinking as to what we really need, front end and real-time generally. The second thing is and it's somewhat working off of Sean's observation and the long arc of this challenge, is the challenge is actually somewhat driven by a mindset about what happens in normal times. And I'll give you an example. Many social services at the local level are funded by CDBG grants, community development block grants. And they're about the closest thing that we have to kind of general spending, regular general spending grants that happen in times of emergency, national disaster emergencies and otherwise. And we have exactly the same problem. The subrecipient tracking all the way down to the ground. And that's because the impetus coming from Washington is to get the money into the field, get customers served, right? And that's it. And what gets missed is the efficacy of the impact of that money which can only be understood if you get all the way down to the lowest level of recipient. And so really what we're talking about actually is a larger philosophy imported into the emergency, which really is no longer an exception, which means we really ought to just rethink the whole thing in terms of permanent models.
Thank you, Joe. I will say, I couldn't agree more that you're saying kind of these emergencies being we know that they are going to come up. We don't know the exact nature of emergencies, the next one, but we know they are going to come up. And I think one thing that the Inspector General community at the federal level has done a really good job at is and one in particular always stands out to me was the Small Business Administration Inspector General issued right after the CARES Act was passed, issued a white paper previewing some of the issues that the Paycheck Protection Program might run into, and said, yes, this is a new program, but it is built off of some of these programs that we have been running for the last 30 plus years at the agency. And here are some lessons we've learned over time that the agency should be implementing to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse in this program. And I think some of them were ignored and to what results, but the IGs at least were doing a really good job kind of foreseeing some of the issues and signaling to the agencies, here are ways that you can be thinking about this, not just as a brand new program. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I just want to say, Joe is exactly right on this. To your point about SBA, Mike Ware, the IG there, issued that alert, not because he had a crystal ball, but because he had hundreds of reports before him saying the agency has these problems. And the SBA was responsible for handing out, under the CARES Act and the pandemic, more money in that one bill than they had been overseeing in their entire history combined, if you add it all up. So that's what he was doing. Same, by the way, with unemployment insurance. The issues identified by the labor IG, again, they didn't need a crystal ball. They just needed to look in the lengthy, if you go on their website, reports they've done over the years about the problems with the program. And they were replicated here because we were now dealing with magnitudes of money that we had dealt with before. They weren't new, and and Joe has seen that at the state and local level as well in the work he's done.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here. We've talked a lot about the federal level. Now let's take a closer look at Chicago and the state and local level. So Amy, your organization, the Chicago Community Trust, has put together a really impressive dashboard illustrating where money from various federal relief programs is ending up not only in the city of Chicago, but also Cook County and the state of Illinois. I would love if you could talk to us a little, walk us through that project, your goals in putting it together, and whether you encountered those same challenges tracking money all the way down to the community impact level that Michael and Sean have touched on at the federal level.
Yes, thank you so much for including me, and I'm thrilled to be part of this discussion and to really kind of like show how these issues at the federal level, like when it really starts kind of like trickling down to like the neighborhood level, have a really big impact on access to information and also access to services, which is what these funds are, a lot of these funds are supposed to be doing. So this is a project that started about a year ago in partnership with the Urban Institute and with the support from the Kresge Foundation, to really, think about like what are challenges that specific cities are facing, and then how can we leverage the capacity of an organization like the Urban Institute to really kind of like do the federal level research for a local impact. So we came up with this dashboard that we're thrilled just launched last month. Because as philanthropy, we've been thinking about what is the role of philanthropy in an economic recovery, and we see these, at the national level, trillions of dollars. At the local level, it's billions of dollars flowing through the region. And when you think about philanthropic support going out the door, the first question you think of is, well, there's all of this federal money coming through. What's the role of philanthropy? How are we being impactful? And does this really need any more money? Because look, this historic and unprecedented amount of funds that are flowing through the region right now. And what we very quickly learned is that sometimes having too much money is a good problem to have, but it's still a problem, especially when we're focused on an equitable and inclusive economic recovery, because it is a fact that in this economic climate and in every economic downturn or recession or depression or whatever you want to call it, Black and Latinx communities are the ones who bear the brunt. They always have. And if we don't do something about it, they always will. So what we've started realizing is that there's this unprecedented amount of money going either through the federal government directly to the end user, or pass through the state, or pass through the city or the county, or pass through the city and the county, just so many avenues for so many topics, and nobody can get a handle of it. Initially, what we wanted to do was influence how funds would be spent. But the city, the county, and the state have committed all of their discretionary ARPA funds through the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund before we had a chance to publish the dashboard. So there's really no influencing where funds will go. But now we're at the point where, like, okay, we know for what topics or programs or to what agencies the funds are being deployed. The next question is like, okay, well, are they being deployed in the form of grants or contracts to nonprofits or small businesses? Are they going directly to the end user? And if so, how? How are we making sure that, the city, county, and state appropriated, for instance, hundreds of millions of dollars, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, for the purpose of preventing violence and community safety, and for violence prevention initiatives. And we know that entities that have been extremely successful at preventing violence are the people who live in their communities, who got up and developed their own grassroots response because they wanted to take their fate into their own hands. But a lot of these are really small nonprofits that recently got set up. In some cases, they're block clubs or community leaders who just said that I need to do something for my community. And they would be great stewards of these funds, but they have to jump through a lot of hurdles to get it. And some of them either won't apply, or they've applied and they're unsuccessful, or maybe they received the money, but now they're thinking like, how am I going to spend all of these funds? So that was our intention with the dashboard, is really to start tracking how the funds are flowing and how can we, as philanthropy, kind of help organizations overcome the challenges so that those funds are really reaching the communities that need to receive them. It would be great if we could get access to that second level of how the funds are flowing, because if you look at our dashboard, we've demonstrated how funds are flowing through the city, county, and state, but that next level of what happens when they leave the government coffers, we're still struggling to find. And the way that we've been looking for it is very unsophisticated. It's things that all of us could do. We Google, we look at press releases, we convert PDFs into spreadsheets, and are putting them into the main kind of like data set to advance this. And we know that this is work that anybody could do, but we've spent hours doing it. And imagine if all of the organizations who wanted to tap into these funds or had these questions spent the same number of hours. That is just incredibly duplicative and a huge waste of time for organizations that at the end of the day are just trying to execute their mission, or just trying to help elevate disinvested communities and households and provide services and prevent violence and generate economic mobility.
Don, I see you've got a thought on that.
Yeah, so two quick thoughts. One, I think some of the questions that Amy was raising from a philanthropy perspective were exactly the same questions that we were hearing at Pogo from, especially from people in Congress as they were doing follow-up bills. They did the CARES Act, and then everyone was wondering, how well did this money work when we're doing the second bill? Should we refill this pot of money, or should we do a different pot of money? Were there any communities that got missed? Were there any industries that got missed? Was this wasted money? Is there too much money here and not enough there? And the reality was, I mean, just like Amy's saying, the answer was a big shrug of the shoulders. No one really was clear. And so Congress, just basically started guessing for those follow-up. But if we had had better information, it could have even informed some of those national pieces of legislation. And then the other thing I'll say that I think is really important about what Amy's saying is that getting down to how the money is used and how well it's used and who uses it best, getting those examples and really starting to compare and contrast between states and cities. And I mean, that is sort of a holy grail for accountability that we could start to actually evaluate, what works best in these programs. Is it someone, as Amy was mentioning, like hyper local, like lives in the community? For another program, it might be something else, might be the factor. But right now, it's very hard for people outside of the program or outside of the in the states, kind of seeing this happen for them to evaluate, because there's really no information beyond the money being spent. There's no kind of what was accomplished, and that's a big missing piece.
Yeah. And in addition to that, Amy, I know you mentioned some of the challenges that some of these organizations face, or the questions that they have in even kind of considering whether or not to apply or how to apply for these programs. And I think, if we have data, hard data that shows, these are the types of organizations that are the best investment for this program, that also can signal to federal agencies, state and local governments, this is somewhere we really need to invest in additional outreach and additional education and additional assistance to better enable those most effective organizations to actually benefit from these programs and be a part of these programs. And so, I think the benefit is like 3 or 4-fold when it comes to what we can do with this kind of information. Joe, I see you've got a thought, and then I've got a question for you. So don't go on mute.
I'm not going anywhere. And this is largely reinforcing of what Amy and Sean were just saying. But Amy, I love that you mentioned the violence prevention money, because you're exactly right. These are micro, local, indigenous, and truly the most knowing of the community that we're attempting to reach. And quite often the most creative, because they are not bounded by sort of calcified thinking, right? So that's where we want to go. But it's those very entries, and we see the same thing in social service context in all across the board, is there's barriers to entry. And the first barrier to entry is to even know what's available, right? And so we're talking transparency at the front end as the first lowering of a barrier to entry. And then the next barrier to entry is bandwidth to even have the time to pursue, right? And these things immediately are impacted by front-end transparency all the way down to the ground. I mean, simply knowing that 2 blocks over, somebody is getting some money, and you could look up what that organization is getting their money, because there's a website that names the organization, bam, you're in the game, right? It's those sorts of very, very sort of human type of things. And the frustrating thing at the other end that Amy mentioned, and it absolutely applies to Chicago, and I know you have a Chicago question probably to come, Liz, is something that actually applies across the country in emergency times, is what we've seen in the pandemic is localities cede emergency power to executives. And that applies to absolutely everything about how we spend money and the processes that we would normally go through before we appropriate and allocate money. Those literally disappear. And that means the money flies, which means we have to do something about the requirements on local government before we actually hand the money to them, because we know it's going to fly out the door.
Yes, and you're right. I've got a Chicago question for you. And then I've got a follow-up question for you that I think I'm going to ask at the same time. But we'll see. But, you know, so you just late last year stepped down from a 12-year run as Chicago's Inspector General. And so you oversaw the office when the vast majority of these federal COVID relief funds were being distributed by state and local governments. So I guess I'm curious, right? We've heard from Michael and Sean the problem tracking this down to the subrecipient level, the community level, at the federal level. We've heard from Amy about the challenges doing that from the outside. So as the Inspector General in Chicago, were you running into the same problems, kind of tracking this information, tracking spending down to where it was ending up in the community? And if so, how is that impacting? And if not, I would love to hear that, because I'd really love to hear if somebody is able to do this. But I'd also love to hear how that impacted your ability to conduct your oversight and your investigations into waste and fraud at the local level.
So absolutely, it's the same thing, and in some respects, it may even be worse. The same sort of impetus for getting the money out the door at the federal level absolutely exists at the local level, right? And again, as I mentioned, processes are suspended, emergency powers are declared. That's a problem in and of itself for accountability, right? And we need to think, I think, back to sort of the broader paradigm is this massive amount of money. There needs to be legitimacy in the mind of the public about what's going on with it. And if we're chasing after the information after the fact, we've already lost that legitimacy game. And quite often that legitimacy is being vindicated through investigations. We don't want to be there, right? And so the problem absolutely there, and whether it's from an audit or an investigation perspective, you have to actually go and sort of stitch together money trails, and they're complicated money trails. The further closer to the ground that you go, that takes time and bandwidth and slows you up and prevents you from sort of making broader findings, efficacy findings, efficiency findings, so on and so forth. So it's absolutely the case, and there's a broad and there needs to be a broad recognition with respect to local government, and this certainly applies in Chicago, is the systems don't necessarily exist to do the tracking in the first place, right? And even within Chicago government, there's a wide range of sophistication of those systems. One would think the third largest city in the United States, a $16 billion budget, 32,000 employees, thousands of contractors, lots of complex things being done. And from department to department, there are systems no longer supported that don't talk to each other, so data can't be looked at across silos. And so it just gets terribly complicated.
That data silo problem is one I know that the federal inspector generals have encountered, but are making great strides in addressing, right, Michael?
Well, so, the last point Joe made, I wanted to pick up on, because it is the challenge, which is not only the state and localities have trouble with portals and IT systems, the federal government doesn't either. This is one of those places where everybody's equal in this problem. The best data, if you go to the PRAC's website, pandemicoversight.gov, and you look at the data we have for all these programs, these $5 trillion worth of spending, the best data there you will find is on the Coronavirus Relief Fund, CRF, which was in the CARES Act, $150 billion that went to state and local communities. And it's the best data you have, not because there was an existing recipient reporting portal. It's there because the Treasury IGs, supported by the PRAC, spent money, millions of dollars, to build a portal. And that's why there's that data. And let me be clear, Joe and I can talk about this forever. Our job is not to do managers' jobs. That's management's job. That's the agency's job. But we did it, they did it in Treasury IG because it was needed, and it was $150 billion, so it was manageable. But That should already exist. As Joe said earlier, none of these problems are new. It's not as if you wake up tomorrow and say, jeepers, a hurricane hit the United States. Isn't that a shock? Or there was a fire somewhere, or other natural disaster, right? These happen all the time.
And it's not philanthropy's job either. And what happens is philanthropy has enormous frustration in this round, because in addition to the money that is coming that they want to have foster good decision making on and good distribution on, their own money is going into the same government systems, and it's really, really hard to get that sense of true accountability and impact in what it is that they're doing. These are really aligned problems that are across multiple realms, and all of this sort of we're all in a position, oversight to some extent, and this is a little bit what I did in my time, and this is a little bit what the PRAC is sort of tending to, and what Michael's referencing is. We're building the machinery that management's supposed to be building. And the hope is, and philanthropy with respect to the CCT's website, building something that government's supposed to be building. The hope is that maybe sometimes we give the government the fish and say, here, use this, right? But there's rules on that. But the real hope is by showing them this, we're teaching them to fish in the future, but there really isn't a constituency for these things.
Yeah. We love to highlight that Treasury portal that they created on their own. And frankly, you are exactly right, Michael, that it is not the Inspector's General job to do that and to provide that reporting platform. And yet I'm really glad they did because, again, as you said, it's the best data we've got. And man, I just wish we had it for all the programs. For all.
And I'll give a shout out to Amy's. I just went on your portal. It's great, but you shouldn't have to do that. Right?
Yeah, I feel like the federal government has way more resources at their disposal than the CCT does.
This really is a labor of love and some skill from some very smart people at the Urban Institute, because I find the information, but they've really made it visual. But one thing that I kind of wanted to elevate to, so before being in the advocacy space, I also worked in government. I worked for Cook County, the state of Illinois, and in Congress. And I kind of want to give public servants a little bit of grace, because I feel like almost all are very well intentioned and really do want to do the right thing. And there's this, and I've been trying to wrap my head around this too, is like this tangle between good government and politics and messaging and constituents and all of these things that are just really, really hard. And I feel like in my days of government, most of my jobs was just handing out civics lessons on why it was that what a constituent wanted me to do was not something that my office could do. And it was probably in their best interest that was the case. But a lot of governments, and especially at the local level, are working on very antiquated legacy systems or homegrown, portals or things that they created because they had to answer one question and really didn't have the resources or the time or the expertise to really think about, we're building this to answer this question today. Something else is going to come up 5, 10, 15 years from now, and how can we make something that's really comprehensive and holistic that will solve for this for many, many years to come? And I don't have the answers to those questions, but it is something that I kind of want to elevate. That I've sat in a lot of tables where we talk about, like, if we had a magic wand and how could we fix the system so that it works better. I try to ask myself now more so, what's the low-hanging fruit that we can start so that we can start chipping at this? Because maybe we're not going to solve for all of this. And if we think about the entire problem, it just seems so huge that, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. So how can we start taking those little bites and not forget about this, because there will inevitably, hopefully not another pandemic, but the economy will have another downturn, maybe sooner than later, hopefully not. But Congress will have to have another economic recovery package or something that helps lift people up who have fallen. And we will find ourselves in these same situations where we're, why don't we have better data? Why weren't we better prepared? Why do these systems work the way that they do? And we're not thinking about technology that doesn't exist. Like if I call, how many people were waiting for help from their local unemployment office because they needed money because they just lost their job and waited weeks to get a phone call? I could chat with somebody online while I'm on hold with United Airlines right now if I had an issue. So that kind of like the customer service and the data and all of this technology that could really improve these systems are just not the sexy investments. And how do we change our mindset of how we think of, or how we prioritize government spending so that the process itself will end up being much smoother?
Yeah, I think, to that last question, I think part of it, or part of our theory is that focusing on the impact that this better tracking will have, not just on program design, but on ability to better find fraud and waste in the system, and, designing interfaces for people who are, or people in organizations that we hope to benefit from these programs, right? So I think by focusing on the impact that we hope to have by this better data collection, I think that's one way we're trying to get at that. How do we make this a thing that is prioritized? But I'm very curious for thoughts, and so I've got a question for Joe and Amy. So I'd really like to get both of your thoughts on something that comes up really frequently in conversations that we have about making these kinds of federal policy improvements that would better enable government to track federal spending down to the community level. So what we often hear is that it would be too burdensome on state and local governments to comply with the more detailed reporting requirements necessary to make it a reality. And it's always puzzled me because I perhaps naively just assume that state and local officials distributing federal funds generally have some idea of where they're sending that money and what they are hoping to get out of that fund distribution and what the recipient is planning to do with it. So I guess my question to you is, am I hopelessly naive? Or and really, do you think, in your opinions, that it would be too burdensome to ask if the federal government is able to kind of en masse create this kind of portal and platform that we've seen Treasury do on their own for one particular program that makes it easier for state and local governments and recipients of funds to input that information? Is it too burdensome to ask the city of Chicago to report to federal agencies where they are choosing to spend federal relief funds and what results they expect to get from those expenditures?
Want the long answer or the short answer?
You know what answer I want, but go ahead.
The short answer is no, it's not too burdensome. It's not too much to expect. If you're getting something, you should be willing to meet some baseline requirements and obligations in return for it. The question becomes one of capacity, and the way that you framed the question or the setup, Liz, sort of spoke to something that is the realm of possibility. That sort of leans into the realm of what makes it possible. If you leave it to each individual government body that already exists on these legacy systems that are antiquated, for which there isn't a constituency for more rigorous sort of IT systems and so on and so forth, it is burdensome. And the expertise and the knowledge and the resources, they don't sit there. But if the money's going to flow down federally, there's one of two things. There is a set aside of a percentage of what's set down that has to go into those systems, right? And maybe even thinking about sort of regional working groups where Illinois has more governmental bodies per capita than anybody in the United States, right? And every one of those governmental bodies has its own system and so on and so forth. you basically facilitate working groups of the key areas of government to sort of create that one system that everybody's going to use that is aligned with federal needs and obligations and the federal systems. The other is that the federal government simply builds it and everybody's got to use it, right? And that's what's been done in the IG community. It was built federally with money allocated from Congress that Michael, has helped champion. And everybody jumps into the pool, and they're from all of these different types of local organizations with different capacities. One of those two things, but there has to be a requirement coming from Washington attached to the money with some specifics as to what the baseline criteria is to hit the mark, and a willingness of Washington to be kind of an assist agency of sorts in actually holding everybody's hand locally and how to get there.
I agree with everything that Joe said. Like, yes, it's certainly possible. I would also like to elevate that there is likely more information out there than we think. The problem is that it's piecemealed and it's spread in a whole bunch of different directions. The city had created a dashboard that shows how they spent a lot of their CARES Act discretionary funds, like when they set up the McCormick Place emergency hospital and a few other contracts that were issued with those funds. And you can see what entities received those contracts. There's another dashboard that they launched in January that's really detailing how they're spending the ARPA SLFRF funds paired with the city's general obligation bond that they issued. And you can see like what has been funded through ARPA and what's been funded through the general obligation bond. Cities, counties, any entity that received SLFRF funds has to complete a quarterly report to Treasury and an annual report to Treasury. And governments want to toot their own horn. So when they come up with something really innovative and they're putting out this grant to help small businesses to pilot a guaranteed income program, they're putting this information out, and it comes out in the form of press releases and lists that they post on their website. And I say this because the dashboard that we've put together all comes from this type of data. We don't have data sharing agreements with any agency. We're having conversations with some government departments to try to get data directly from them, so it's a little easier on us. But what you're seeing right now is essentially compiling what governments have either by obligation or voluntarily already put out there.
All right, we are going to go to some of the questions we received from the audience in 1 second. I've got one question to close us out, coming to you, Michael. In some of the PRAC reports, you have highlighted that the Office of Management and Budget, part of the White House, is taking steps to improve some of these data issues, as the IGs have been really helpfully pointing out to them, are posing really big challenges. So maybe let's end on a hopeful note. How hopeful are you that policymakers are zeroed in on the right problems and are will adequately fix the problem in the near future to enable that gold standard oversight for, I guess at this point, we are kind of ending the spending cycle on the pandemic, but we also have the infrastructure spending package, and we've got programs funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So I guess how hopeful are you that we are moving in the right direction and that we will start seeing some of this better reporting?
So, Liz, I do think there's some hope. I think what has happened in the last 2 years has caused people to rethink this. OMB has put out new guidance last year that would do more and tell agencies to do more. It's not perfect, but it's a very big step forward from where we were. And I think you hit on, and others hit on, the reason why this is happening. Two things. It's all about accountability. It's the fraud that occurred, the misconduct, improper payments on the one hand. On the other hand, it's the issues around equity and trying to figure out whether the money went to the people it was intended to benefit. For example, in the CARES Act, one of the programs, PPP program, was by statute, it was designed to help as well specifically communities that needed particular help. Well, when SBAIG went to the agency and said, okay, what's the data that shows if that went to the right people, or at least a percentage? The answer was, we don't know, because they didn't code for it. They never checked for it, even though, going back to, I think, Sean, your comment, the statute said that's something you should do. There's no way of knowing. We heard the same thing with the restaurant revitalization program, the funding there, and the broadband program. Issues like that we're hearing about over and over again. So I think that's driving it from all sides. Everybody wants to make sure there's accountability and that by statute, the money's going to the right place. And I'll just add, because it'll pick up one of the questions in the question area, which is there's this false choice out there between collect everything, bog down people with hundreds, thousands of reports, and do nothing. That those are the only two choices. And any policymaker, every policymaker knows there's thousands of choices in between those two extremes. The same thing with the fraud question that's in the chat. How could all this money go out with minimal vetting? That was a choice that was made. When we went to the agencies, SBA in particular, and said, you're sending out money based on self-certifications. In other words, people filled out a loan and said, I am who I say I am, and I own this business because I said it. Banks don't give out money based on that normally, right? You need to actually show proof of something. That didn't happen here. It was self-certification. And what we heard back when the IG complained and we at the PRAC complained was two choices. We were in a calamity back in March, April 2020, which we were, and we had two choices. We could just send the money out on self-certification, or we could bog it down for months in trying to figure out what happened. Well, you know what? More than 50,000 applications were from people who were on the already existing Treasury Department's do not pay list. And nobody even looked at it. So would have that taken a day, maybe an hour? Not a long time, right?
Yeah.
It's a false choice.
Yeah, and that's the one that really kills me, because if you're prioritizing speed in getting, I understand why you would prioritize speed in getting money out the door, particularly when we're in a situation like we were in March and April 2020. But without basic checks, and I think this goes back to the point that Joe was making earlier, planning ahead and planning ahead for crises that may come, benefiting from lessons learned in implementing these programs at the outset. Take it, I think you're right, Michael. We can be somewhere in the middle. But what kills me about that choice between getting money out the door fast or getting it out the door right is if you're getting it out the door just quickly, then you are, good, chances are really good that it's not going where it's intended to go. And so who are you actually benefiting by putting the full priority on speed rather than a little bit, slowing it down just a little bit to make sure that you're not sending it out to known fraudsters. So Sean, go ahead. And then I've got a question for you, Joe, that I'm going to get in there before you make the point that you are ready to make.
So I wanted to respectfully temper some of Michael's optimism. I do believe that OMB's recent guidance was encouraging. I think we're heading in the right direction. There's clearly some lessons being learned that they're incorporating here, and so I was encouraged by it, definitely. That being said, I mean, Liz, you kind of were like, are we going to get to that gold standard? And at this point, I'd be impressed if we got to the bronze standard. Honestly, I mean, I think agencies. I think one of the reasons we don't do it, Amy said it earlier, it's not sexy. It's a lot of work, and the reality is you get very little political payoff. And so there's a cost benefit that occurs inside these agencies. Is this where we, put our effort, keep pushing, because it's not easy. It doesn't happen quickly. And so you have to stay on top of it and be making these changes. And if you're not going to get credit for it and you're not going to look good, not only that, but sometimes you wind up looking bad because you find problems and then you're blamed for the problems, not patted on the back for finding them and trying to fix them in the future. And so there's a real tension here that I think will quickly slow the progress we're seeing. At least that's my expectation after looking at this for years, if there's not a continual pressure from Congress, from the White House, or somebody to keep doing more and do better.
I'm gonna hold on to that last thing that you said, Sean, because I think we definitely can keep that pressure up. But I hear what you're saying. And yes, so that was a leading question. I would not be a great litigator. Joe, one question that came in the Q&A that I think maybe you're well situated to speak to is, if agencies can view requirements for reporting and fraud prevention as optional, how can state and local agencies be held accountable if they run afoul of the requirements? So I don't know if this is something you ran into as Chicago Inspector General, but I know that that's one of the reasons why Treasury created their own portal, because they were hearing from state and local governments saying, we want to be in compliance with these statutory requirements, and I can really sympathize with that. And so I guess I pose the question to you, and then also you can make the point that you are ready to make.
The question actually goes into what I was holding in mind, which is, we all have to recognize that emergencies are not the context to be making good policy decisions. Emergencies are not the context, and we're going to be making good accountability decisions. The politics and political imperatives of emergency rides roughshod over everything that we're talking about. And what that means is, props to Sean for using the term quickly slow. And I'm going to hold on to that because it's that sort of phraseology that really describes a lot of what it is to be in the oversight and in the government administration game. Everything quickly slows. It's absolutely right. But that partly sort of goes to what we do in states of emergency, which means that what we need to do at all levels of government is actually conduct ourselves iteratively rather than episodically. And that's what we don't do very well. We learn the lessons. The conversation being had here is the conversation that needs to be had everywhere, so that we're actually building systems for resilience for the next emergency that's coming right around the corner, right? And we're doing that locally. And the answer to the question on local government is, where's the accountability? The imposition from Washington of requirements, there's still a question of whether or not they're truly going to be enforced. And when we're in an emergency situation and you have all this variability actually in the sophistication and the bandwidth of government bodies in emergencies, the likelihood is that the government entity at the local level isn't going to be held accountable for it, right? And you're going to actually run into lots of situations, especially with small localities, where they don't have the bandwidth to actually understand everything that they're being obligated to do, right? So we have to recognize accountability has its limitations as well, and we have to be reasonable about what we are imposing on the localities. And again, I think we have to think from that that perspective that says that the federal government might have to actually be a form of support agency to actually create the infrastructure that allows the localities that would like to be in compliance to actually comply, especially in times when the emergency imperatives are going to override everything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, I think we've got time for maybe two more audience questions. Michael, I've got one for you that I think would be, that I hope is a quick one. The SIGPER, the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery, has drafted the Strengthening Pandemic Relief Oversight Act, which would extend their office by 5 years because their office is set to sunset when many of the loans and financial programs that they're overseeing, the information is due back in. The audits are due back in. So that seems like a pretty easy fix for Congress, one that we've certainly added to our agenda for some of our advocacy work here at POGO. But is the PRAC in need of anything similar? And if so, do you have plans to keep PRAC going long enough for you to be able to fulfill your mission?
So, So what we have been doing is engaging with Congress on extending the ability of IGs to use the data analytics platform that we've created. We learned pretty quickly that you can't oversee $5 trillion of spending with just people. You needed the ability to use the data that was available. Whatever data that is available, we could use. And it's been very instructive. We've seen, for example, how one Social Security number was used to get unemployment benefits in 29 states because the federal government systems and the state systems don't talk to one another. So we want to keep that platform in place. We've engaged in bipartisan discussions about that. On the Hill, we've had indications of support for it, and that's our hope that we can do that. Whether the PRAC is continued in by some other name, or in its current version and expanded, its responsibility, that'll be up to Congress to figure out. But what we really want to do is make sure the infrastructure for oversight is continued. You can then figure out who's going to run it and what the people are, but you need the infrastructure.
Excellent. All right, and last question to Amy, and then Joe, if you've got a thought on it. I assume, okay, you are familiar with the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, GATA, and the GATA portal that was created. And this is picking up on context clues, is a Chicago or an Illinois initiative. And could something like that, and there was a portal created with it, could something like that be used at the state and federal level to help report what the end user of these grants is spending money on?
Yeah, so for those who are not in Illinois, GATA, the Government Accountability and Transparency Act, is a requirement for any, mainly nonprofits, but any entity applying for a grant offered by the state of Illinois, whether it's federally funded or state funded or what have you. Organizations have to be GATA certified before they can apply for a grant. So yes, it does. It's something that helps with the transparency and the due diligence of making sure that the money is going to go to an organization that can appropriately receive it. There are some challenges with this system and unintended consequences. For instance, if an organization comes across a grant that's been posted and they want to apply for it, but they're not GATA certified yet, there is no way that they will be able to obtain GATA certification and apply for that grant before that RFP expires. So it's already a missed opportunity. And I wanted to speak on this in particular because I think we've elevated some important questions. Number one is, how are we making sure that the funds are going to the communities that need them and are going to have the greatest impact and achieve the intention of these trillions of dollars? The other is, how do we make sure that waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't happen? And this is kind of like going back to my old food insecurity days, and there's a lot of conversations about, public benefits deservedness and waste, fraud, and abuse. And the truth is that in those programs, the waste, fraud, and abuse is actually a very, very small percentage of the total picture and the positive impact. But it also kind of speaks to, do we care when the plane lands safely? No. But do we care when government did something wrong? Yes. And that's what gets attention. And I feel like when we're thinking about, there is a way, I think, to be guided by making sure these funds go to where they need to go. And we set up those systems in a way that's just going to deter the waste, fraud, and abuse. Because if we lead ourselves with well, how do we make sure that the bad characters aren't getting this money, we run the risk of the unintended consequences that the good characters are going to have a really hard time getting it, and we're not going to achieve the end result.
Excellent, thank you. Joe, did you still have your hand up as a holdover from? Okay, excellent. All right, no problem. Thank you so much to our panelists. We are coming up to the conclusion. I'm going to hand it back to Dylan in 1 second to close us out, but I just wanted to thank you guys so much for joining. Amy, Joe, Sean, and Michael, this has been, this conversation has far exceeded my wildest dreams for this panel. Thank you all so much for your work and for taking the time out of your day today to help share your expertise with the folks that were able to join. I am not surprised we had so many audience questions. I think this is an issue that people are really starting to zero in on and understand, not just the implications for their own day-to-day life, but also as we start to kind of come to this concept of, there will always be emergencies and disasters that we need to respond to. And so it is imperative that we start to really get it right and learn from these lessons. So thank you so much for joining us today. Dylan, I'm going to send it over to you to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Liz, for leading us today and bringing this group of people together. And thank you, Michael, Amy, Sean, Joe, as well, for your really incredible insights and contributions. I think there are no easy answers here is a takeaway, but I knew that given your combined expertise and experience here, that this conversation would be really incredibly nuanced and interesting and timely, and I think certainly didn't disappoint. So thank you again for joining us. A reminder that you can learn more about our work from our websites at effectivegov.uchicago.edu. As well as at pogo.org, as well as on Twitter. So thank you again on behalf of the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government and the Project on Government Oversight. We so appreciate you joining us for this event today, and we hope to see you again soon.